The silence on the bridge of the Zornak mothership was absolute. Holographic displays flickered with impossibly detailed scans of a small blue planet, its surface a patchwork of continents and oceans that seemed almost laughably insignificant against the backdrop of galactic majesty. Captain Krellax adjusted the neural interface collar that connected directly to the ship's sensory systems. Thousands of years of galactic exploration had taught the Zornak one fundamental truth. Every species could be categorized, every civilization could be understood, and ultimately, every world could be assimilated. Earth would be no different. The preliminary reports were almost comical in their primitive nature. A species barely a century into space exploration, still relying on chemical rockets and primitive nuclear technologies. Their communication networks were a chaotic mesh of electromagnetic signals, broadcasting everything from entertainment to global communications with a lack of sophistication that bordered on the adorable. Preliminary assessment complete, announced researcher Vexna, her tentacle-like appendages dancing across the holographic interface. Technological capacity is minimal. Defensive capabilities are fractured. Planetary resources are ripe for harvesting. Krellax didn't respond immediately. Something about the scans bothered him. A subtle irregularity that defied the standard metrics of potential resistance. The first official communication came precisely at 900 hours, Galactic Standard Time. The transmission was neither panicked nor subservient. Instead, it carried a tone of professional courtesy that felt almost dismissive. Emily Thompson sat in a minimalist conference room, her navy blue suit crisp and unwrinkled. Behind her, a wall of windows revealed a cityscape that was both sophisticated and strangely calm. No signs of the impending alien contact seemed to disturb the rhythm of human activity visible beyond the glass. "Greetings," she said, her voice smooth and measured. "I understand you've traveled a considerable distance. I hope your journey was comfortable." The universal translator struggled for a moment, not with language, but with the underlying psychological subtext. Where was the fear? The submission? The desperate attempt to negotiate? Researcher Vexna leaned closer to the communication display. Preliminary linguistic analysis suggests complete cognitive dissonance. Subject appears unaware of the potential threat. Krellax knew better. After centuries of galactic conquest, he recognized something far more dangerous than fear or aggression. The human was studying them. "We are the Zornak Collective," Krellax responded, choosing the most intimidating dialect in their communication matrix. "Your planet has been identified as a potential resource zone. Prepare for initial assessment and potential integration." Emily Thompson's smile didn't change. If anything, it became slightly more pronounced. "Assessment," she repeated, as if testing the word. Interesting choice of terminology. Meanwhile, deep beneath the conference room, in a facility that didn't officially exist, a team of specialists began their own assessment. Quantum computers hummed with calculations, psychological profiles were being constructed in real time, and a network of experts from disciplines ranging from xenolinguistics to quantum psychology began their work. The city outside continued its rhythm. Trains moved, coffee shops bustled, children went to school. Nothing suggested that first contact was happening mere meters away. Krellax felt something he hadn't experienced in decades. A tiny, almost imperceptible sensation that humans might later describe as unease. "We have multiple planetary defense systems prepared," Emily continued, her tone still conversational. "I'm sure you've detected them in your initial scans, but I suspect that's not why you're here." The Zornak communication systems registered multiple anomalies. Subtle data streams that shouldn't exist were threading through their most secure channels. Not an attack. Not an invasion. Something else entirely. Something that looked disturbingly like understanding. "Your arrival," Emily said, "is going to be fascinating." And for the first time in the Zornak Collective's history, a first contact scenario began to feel like something other than a predetermined conquest. Dr. Michael Rodriguez adjusted the quantum-encrypted neural interface, his fingers dancing across holographic displays that seemed to breathe with living information. The research facility, buried beneath the Rocky Mountains, hummed with a quiet intensity that belied the extraordinary work happening within its reinforced walls. Jack Peterson sat motionless in the primary observation chamber. A veteran of 3 special operations theaters, he looked like any other 40-something former Marine. Weathered, compact, with eyes that held stories most would never comprehend. But today, he was something else entirely. A subject. A test case. A potential key to understanding humanity's most profound psychological defense. Initiating first-stage neural probe, announced Dr. Rodriguez to the team of international researchers. Representatives from 12 different countries watched through encrypted communication channels, each holding their breath. The Zornak had no idea what they were about to encounter. Preliminary studies had revealed something extraordinary about human psychological resilience. Where other species would collapse under sustained mental pressure, humans seemed to do something entirely unexpected. They didn't just resist. They transformed. The neural probe began its initial sweep. Designed to exploit the deepest psychological vulnerabilities of known sentient species, it was a weapon that had systematically broken civilizations across multiple star systems. Developed over millennia by the Zornak, it was supposed to be unbeatable. Jack Peterson didn't even blink. Inside his mind, something remarkable was happening. The neural probe wasn't just failing to break through. It was being analyzed, mapped, understood. Peterson's brain was treating the psychological assault like an intricate puzzle, breaking down its components, identifying its structural weaknesses. Dr. Rodriguez watched the neural mapping in real time. The display showed something unprecedented. Where most subjects would show fracturing neural patterns, signs of psychological stress, and imminent breakdown, Peterson's brain was doing something else entirely. It was learning. Fascinating, he muttered, knowing the entire observation team could hear him. It's not just resistance. It's adaptive integration. The Zornak research vessel orbiting Earth received the first preliminary reports. Researcher Vexna's appendages trembled with a mixture of scientific excitement and growing concern. The human test subject wasn't just surviving the neural probe. He was consuming it. Jack Peterson's mind worked like a sophisticated organic computer. Each psychological attack vector was not just deflected but cataloged, understood, transformed into something new. It was as if the human brain didn't recognize the concept of psychological trauma, instead treating it like raw data to be processed and integrated. Increase probe intensity to level 7, Dr. Rodriguez instructed. The team exchanged glances. Level 7 had never been used in human testing. It was a setting reserved for the most resilient known species in the galaxy, and even they had failed catastrophically at level 5. The neural interface hummed. Quantum algorithms designed to exploit the most fundamental psychological vulnerabilities began their assault. Jack Peterson's breathing remained steady. In the observation room, Dr. Sarah Goldman, a leading expert in xenopsychology, leaned forward. Her background in trauma psychology, combined with her extensive research on human resilience, gave her a unique perspective. "It's not about blocking," she said quietly. "It's about integration. Humans don't fight psychological pressure. They absorb it, transform it." The neural probe intensified. Most species would have been reduced to psychological fragments by now. Broken, shattered, rendered non-functional. Jack Peterson began to smile. Not a smile of defiance. Not a smile of victory. A smile of understanding. The Zornak research vessel received updated data streams. The human test subject was now actively engaging with the neural probe, his brain creating complex neural pathways that shouldn't be possible. It was less like a defensive mechanism and more like a form of psychological martial arts, turning the attack's own energy against itself. Dr. Rodriguez made a note in the official report. This wasn't just a test. This was a demonstration. Humanity's most terrifying ability wasn't technological. It wasn't physical strength. It was something far more profound. The capacity to transform psychological assault into growth. The ability to look into the face of fundamental psychological pressure and not just survive, but evolve. The research vessel hung in low Earth orbit like a crystalline nightmare. Massive quantum resonance chambers hummed with alien technologies that had systematically dismantled civilizations across hundreds of star systems. Today, they would be turned against Lieutenant Alexandra Reyes. Researcher Vexna adjusted the neural interface protocols with growing frustration. The previous tests had revealed something unprecedented. Humans didn't just resist psychological manipulation. They consumed it, transformed it, turned what should have been a weapon of destruction into a tool of understanding. Alexandra sat perfectly still in the observation chamber. Her military background was evident in her posture, precise, controlled, but never rigid. Unlike previous test subjects who approached these experiments with fear or defiance, she radiated a calm curiosity that was far more unnerving. Initiating advanced psychological deconstruction protocol, announced the lead Zornak researcher, his vocal modulations betraying a hint of anticipation. The first wave of psychological pressure would have reduced most known sentient species to quivering neurological fragments. Carefully crafted algorithmic attacks designed to exploit fundamental cognitive vulnerabilities began their assault. Alexandra's first response was unexpected. Not resistance, not submission. A question. "Interesting approach," she said, her voice clinical and detached. "Could you explain the methodological framework behind this particular intervention?" The universal translator struggled momentarily. This wasn't a response in any traditional sense. It was a complete reframing of the psychological assault. Researcher Vexna's neural link flickered with confusion. The human wasn't just defending against the psychological attack. She was analyzing it, dissecting it, treating the most sophisticated mental warfare technique in the galaxy like an academic research problem. Deep within the research vessel's core, quantum computers began to overheat. The psychological algorithms were designed to break, to fragment, to destroy. Instead, they were being parsed, categorized, and understood with terrifying efficiency. Alexandra's background was crucial. A doctorate in cognitive neuroscience, combined with advanced military training in psychological warfare, made her the perfect subject. But it was something more, a fundamental human characteristic that defied all known psychological models. The ability to transform trauma into understanding. "Your approach," she continued, "suggests a hierarchical psychological assault model with recursive feedback loops." Fascinating. Most species would experience this as pure terror. I'm seeing it as a complex systems problem. The Zornak researchers exchanged neural communications that translated roughly to confusion and growing alarm. This wasn't resistance. This was something else entirely. Another wave of psychological pressure was deployed. Technologies that had reduced entire civilizations to neurological dust were unleashed with increasing intensity. Quantum-entangled cognitive disruptors, multidimensional psychological fracturing algorithms, weapons of mental destruction that should have been unimaginably devastating. Alexandra took notes. Her neural patterns showed something impossible. Where most subjects would display increasing stress responses, her brain was creating new neural pathways, adapting, growing. The psychological assault wasn't just being resisted, it was being studied. "Fascinating," she muttered, making another annotation. "The quantum entanglement mechanism creates interesting cognitive dissonance at the synaptic level." Researcher Vexna's primary neural cluster began to experience something close to panic. This wasn't a test subject. This was a predator studying its hunter. The research vessel's primary systems began to register anomalies. Subtle data streams were threading back through the psychological attack vectors. Not in counterattack. Something far more dangerous. Understanding. Hours passed. The psychological assault continued. Most species would have been reduced to neurological dust within minutes. Alexandra continued her systematic analysis, her neural patterns showing not just resistance, but active engagement. Increasing intensity to maximum protocol, the lead researcher announced, a hint of desperation in the translated communication. Alexandra looked up, a slight smile crossing her face. "Ready when you are," she responded. The Zornak researchers realized something fundamental had changed. This was no longer an experiment. This was first contact of a completely different kind. The classified research facility beneath the Rocky Mountains was never meant to be understood by outside observers. Layers of quantum encryption, psychological firewalls, and advanced computational systems created a sanctuary of human potential that defied conventional understanding. Dr. Emily Nakamura stood before a wall of holographic displays, her fingers tracing complex neural mapping patterns that seemed to breathe with living information. Years of research had led to this moment, the comprehensive understanding of humanity's most profound psychological capability. It wasn't a weapon in any traditional sense. It was something far more terrifying. The classified files told a story that would shatter every known galactic understanding of psychological resilience. Humanity's true strength wasn't technological. It wasn't physical. It was something that existed in the space between trauma and transformation. The ability to not just survive psychological assault, but to grow from it. Dr. Nakamura pulled up a series of case studies. Veterans who had experienced the most extreme psychological trauma. Survivors of natural disasters. Individuals who had faced seemingly insurmountable psychological challenges. Each file told the same remarkable story. Where other species would break, humans rebuilt. More than that, they evolved. The Zornak research vessel continued its orbital analysis, completely unaware that they were being studied far more comprehensively than they were studying humanity. Every transmission, every psychological probe, every attempt at manipulation was being parsed, understood, and integrated into a growing body of knowledge. A knock interrupted her thoughts. Jack Peterson entered the secure research wing. The Marine who had become the first comprehensive test subject of the alien psychological probes looked different. Not physically, but something in his eyes suggested a fundamental change. "The latest neural mapping is complete," he said, sliding a quantum-encrypted drive across the table. Dr. Nakamura understood immediately. This wasn't just data. This was a comprehensive deconstruction of the most advanced psychological warfare technique in the known galaxy. The Zornak had no idea what they had unleashed. Psychological resilience wasn't a passive defense. It was an active, transformative process. Humans didn't just resist trauma. They consumed it, broke it down, rebuilt themselves at a fundamental neural level. The case studies were remarkable. A war veteran who had experienced the most extreme psychological torture didn't just recover. He became a leading expert in trauma recovery. A survivor of a devastating earthquake didn't just rebuild her life. She developed revolutionary architectural techniques that could save millions. Trauma, for humans, was not a wound. It was raw material for growth. Dr. Nakamura pulled up the comprehensive research summary. Years of classified studies, cross-referencing thousands of psychological profiles, had revealed something unprecedented. The human brain didn't just heal. It adapted, evolved, transformed. Each psychological assault created new neural pathways, expanded cognitive capabilities, increased psychological flexibility. What the Zornak saw as a weapon of destruction, humans saw as an opportunity for growth. The classified files told a story of extraordinary potential. Individuals who had faced the most extreme psychological challenges didn't just survive. They became something more resilient, more adaptable, more fundamentally human. Jack Peterson watched the displays, understanding the profound implications. "They think they're studying us," he said quietly. "We're studying them." Dr. Nakamura nodded. The real experiment wasn't happening in the research facility. It was happening in orbit. In the subtle dance of psychological interaction between two fundamentally different species. The Zornak believed they were conducting an investigation. They had no idea they were the ones being comprehensively analyzed. Every psychological probe, every attempt at manipulation, every subtle communication was being broken down, understood, and integrated into a growing body of human knowledge. The weapon wasn't technological. It wasn't physical. It was the extraordinary human capacity to transform psychological assault into an opportunity for growth. To look into the face of trauma and see not destruction, but potential. The true first contact was happening at a level far deeper than any galactic civilization could comprehend. The galactic communication network trembled. Information traveled faster than light, carried by quantum-entangled communication relays that had connected civilizations for millennia. But never had a single piece of data caused such widespread panic and fascination. Transmission logs from the Zornak research vessel began to circulate among the most secure communication channels of known space. Encrypted, scrambled, hidden behind layers of quantum security. But nothing could contain the fundamental truth they revealed. Humans were different. On the methane-rich world of Krullifor, a coalition of subjugated species gathered in their underground communication hub. Representatives from 12 different civilizations watched the data streams with a mixture of terror and hope. The Zornak had been their psychological overlords for centuries, using advanced neural technologies to maintain control, to suppress, to break the spirit of entire civilizations. Now something had changed. "They're not resisting," whispered Cathar, a representative from the silicon-based life forms of the Proxima cluster. "They're absorbing, transforming." The data showed something unprecedented. Where previous species had been systematically broken by psychological warfare, humans were doing something else entirely. They were learning, growing, expanding their cognitive capabilities with each psychological assault. It wasn't just resistance. It was evolution in real time. Communication networks began to buzz with speculation. Encrypted channels carried whispers of a species that didn't just survive psychological pressure. They consumed it, transformed it, turned what should have been a weapon of destruction into a tool of unprecedented understanding. On the crystalline homeworld of the Vendra Collective, neural historians began to rewrite entire volumes of understanding about psychological warfare. The human approach defied every known model of cognitive resistance. They weren't fighting. They were growing. Researcher Vexna's preliminary reports continued to circulate, each transmission revealing more of the extraordinary human capability. Psychological probes that had systematically destroyed civilizations were being treated like academic research problems, opportunities for understanding, raw material for cognitive expansion. The implications were terrifying. For millennia, the Zornak had maintained galactic control through psychological manipulation, neural technologies that could break the spirit of entire civilizations, techniques of mental warfare so advanced that resistance seemed impossible. Humans were rewriting those rules. Communication networks began to change. Subjugated species started to share information about human psychological research, techniques of trauma recovery, methods of cognitive adaptation, ways of transforming psychological assault into growth. It wasn't a revolution. It was a fundamental reimagining of psychological potential. On the methane seas of Krullifor, Cathar began to compile a comprehensive report. The data was clear. Humans didn't just resist psychological pressure. They saw it as an opportunity, a chance to grow, to expand, to become something more. The Zornak had no idea what they had unleashed. Quantum communication relays carried the most extraordinary revelation. Humans weren't just surviving psychological assault. They were actively studying it, breaking it down, understanding its fundamental mechanisms. What the Zornak saw as a weapon of control, humans saw as a research opportunity. Communication networks began to shift. Encrypted channels carried something unprecedented: hope. If humans could do this, what might other species learn? The galactic communication network continued to tremble. Information spread faster than light, carried by quantum-entangled relays that had connected civilizations for millennia. But never before had a single piece of data carried so much potential for transformation. Humans weren't just a species. They were a fundamental reimagining of psychological potential. And the galaxy was about to change forever. Ambassador Rachel Bennett stood at the center of the most extraordinary diplomatic chamber in human history. Surrounding her were holographic representations of 17 different galactic civilizations, each a swirling mass of complex biological and technological configurations that would have been incomprehensible to human observers just months ago. This wasn't a traditional diplomatic meeting. This was a fundamental reimagining of interspecies communication. The Zornak delegation sat stiffly, their neural interfaces crackling with barely contained tension. Captain Krelax watched Ambassador Bennett with a mixture of professional caution and something that might have been interpreted as respect, if respect could exist between fundamentally different forms of consciousness. Your psychological control strategies, Rachel began, her voice calm and analytical, represent a fascinating study in collective manipulation. The translation algorithms worked overtime, capturing not just the words, but the underlying psychological nuance. Where other diplomatic encounters would have been exercises in posturing and threat, this was something else entirely. A deconstruction, an analysis, a systematic dismantling of millennia-old psychological control mechanisms. Each civilization watching understood something profound was happening. The Zornak had built their galactic dominance on a simple principle: psychological control was more effective than physical force. Neural technologies that could break the spirit of entire civilizations. Techniques of mental warfare so advanced that resistance seemed impossible. Rachel Bennett was rewriting those rules in real time. Let's discuss the fundamental mechanisms of your neural interface protocols, she continued, pulling up complex holographic displays that mapped the Zornak's psychological control strategies. The recursive feedback loops you've developed are particularly interesting from a systemic perspective. Captain Krelax felt something he hadn't experienced in centuries. Confusion. This wasn't negotiation. This was a comprehensive academic deconstruction of their entire approach to galactic control. The other observing civilizations watched in stunned silence. Representatives from species that had been subjugated for millennia leaned closer to their communication interfaces. The Zornak's carefully constructed systems of control were being systematically taken apart, not through military might, not through technological superiority, but through pure analytical understanding. Rachel's approach was breathtaking in its simplicity and complexity. She wasn't attacking the Zornak psychological systems. She was understanding them, breaking them down to their most fundamental components, revealing their internal contradictions, showing how their methods of control were, in fact, fundamentally limiting their own potential. Your neural interface technologies, she explained, create a fascinating paradox of control. By limiting psychological variation, you've actually reduced your own adaptive capabilities. The translation algorithms captured something more than words. They captured a fundamental challenge to the Zornak's entire understanding of interspecies interaction. Watching from the research facility beneath the Rocky Mountains, Dr. Emily Nakamura and Jack Peterson monitored every subtle nuance of the communication. This wasn't just diplomacy. This was a comprehensive psychological case study. The observing civilizations began to understand something profound. Humanity's diplomatic approach wasn't about winning. It was about understanding, transforming, growing. Captain Krelax realized something fundamental had changed. The human wasn't just negotiating. She was revealing the internal limitations of the Zornak's entire approach to galactic interaction. Every psychological control mechanism was being systematically deconstructed, not through force, through understanding. The diplomatic chamber became a living demonstration of humanity's most extraordinary capability. The ability to look at systems of control and see not threats, but opportunities for growth, for transformation. For the first time in galactic history, a diplomatic encounter was becoming something more than a negotiation. It was becoming a comprehensive reimagining of interspecies potential. And the galaxy would never be the same. The underground chamber on Krelivor pulsed with an energy that defied conventional understanding. Representatives from species that had been subjugated for millennia now sat side by side, their communication interfaces humming with a collective potential that was both terrifying and transformative. Thar, the The silicon-based representative from the Proxima cluster activated the primary holographic display. Fragments of human psychological research cascaded through the air. Complex neural mapping, trauma recovery techniques, methods of collective psychological adaptation that seemed to defy every known galactic model of species development. "We are witnessing something unprecedented," Cathar announced, their crystalline form shimmering with electromagnetic signals of excitement. Not a revolution, a fundamental reimagining of psychological potential. The chamber represented a coalition that would have been impossible mere months ago. Species that had been bitter enemies, manipulated into conflict by the Zornak's psychological control mechanisms, now found themselves united by a single extraordinary revelation. Humans had shown them a way out. Not through violence. Through understanding. Representatives from 15 different civilizations studied the human research with an intensity that bordered on religious revelation. The Vendra Collective's neural historians had already begun rewriting entire volumes of understanding about psychological resilience. The methane-based life forms from the outer spiral arms were developing entirely new communication protocols based on human trauma recovery techniques. Dr. Michael Rodriguez's classified research papers became a blueprint for collective psychological liberation. Each species began to recognize the fundamental truth that the Zornak had suppressed for millennia. Psychological trauma wasn't a weakness. It was an opportunity for growth. The holographic displays showed case studies that defied conventional understanding. Humans who had experienced the most extreme psychological challenges didn't just recover. They transformed. They used their experiences as fuel for unprecedented personal and collective growth. "Look," said Invera, a representative from the energy-based life forms of the Centauri Nexus. "They don't see psychological pressure as a threat. They see it as raw material for evolution." The implications were staggering. Entire civilizations had been maintained through carefully constructed systems of psychological control. The Zornak had perfected technologies that could break the spirit of entire species, maintaining galactic dominance through neural manipulation that was both subtle and absolute. Humans had shown there was another way. Communication networks began to change. Encrypted channels carried not just information, but a fundamentally new approach to understanding collective potential. Species that had been isolated and controlled began to reach out to one another, sharing techniques of psychological recovery, methods of collective resilience. Cathar compiled a comprehensive report. The data was clear and extraordinary. Humans weren't just offering a method of resistance. They were providing a complete framework for psychological transformation. Where the Zornak saw control, humans saw potential. The underground chamber became a living demonstration of a new possibility. Species that had been enemies for centuries now sat together, united by a single revolutionary concept. Psychological challenges were not something to be feared or suppressed. They were opportunities for growth. The holographic displays continued to cascade with human research, techniques of collective healing, methods of transforming individual trauma into collective strength, approaches to communication that saw conflict not as a threat, but as a chance for mutual understanding. "We are not just learning," Invera said, their energy form pulsing with excitement. "We are being given a chance to reimagine ourselves." Each representative understood the profound nature of what was happening. This was more than a political coalition. This was a fundamental transformation of galactic potential. The Zornak had no idea what they had unleashed. A coalition was forming. Not through military might, not through technological superiority, but through the extraordinary human capacity to see potential where others saw only destruction. The galaxy was about to change forever. The diplomatic chamber hung in absolute silence. Captain Krillax of the Zornak Collective understood something fundamental had changed. This was no longer a negotiation. This was a complete reimagining of galactic interaction. Ambassador Rachel Bennett stood at the center of a holographic display that represented 17 different civilizations. Her presentation wasn't a threat. It wasn't a negotiation. It was a comprehensive deconstruction of millennia-old psychological control mechanisms. Your systems of galactic control, she explained, her voice calm and analytical, are fundamentally limited by your inability to see psychological challenges as opportunities for growth. The translation algorithms captured more than words. They captured a fundamental challenge to everything the Zornak believed about interspecies interaction. Dr. Michael Rodriguez watched from the research facility beneath the Rocky Mountains. Beside him, Jack Peterson studied the diplomatic exchange with the careful eye of someone who had been at the forefront of humanity's most extraordinary psychological research. This was First Contact reimagined, not as a moment of conquest, but as a moment of collective understanding. A holographic display showed something unprecedented: case studies of human psychological resilience, methods of transforming trauma into growth, techniques of communication that saw conflict not as a threat, but as an opportunity for mutual understanding. Captain Krelax felt something he hadn't experienced in centuries: uncertainty. The Zornak had built their galactic dominance on a simple principle: psychological control was more effective than physical force. Neural technologies that could break the spirit of entire civilizations. Techniques of mental warfare so advanced that resistance seemed impossible. Humans were revealing those techniques as fundamentally limited. Consider, Rachel continued, pulling up complex neural mapping displays, how your approach to psychological control actually limits your own evolutionary potential. The observing civilizations leaned closer to their communication interfaces. Representatives from species that had been subjugated for millennia watched with a mixture of hope and anticipation. This wasn't just a diplomatic encounter. This was a fundamental reimagining of galactic potential. Dr. Emily Nakamura's research was being demonstrated in real time. The human approach wasn't about winning. It was about understanding, transforming, growing. Each civilization began to understand something profound. Psychological challenges weren't something to be feared or suppressed. They were opportunities for collective evolution. The chamber became a living demonstration of humanity's most extraordinary capability. The ability to look at systems of control and see not threats, but potential for mutual growth. Captain Krelax realized the true nature of what was happening. The human wasn't just negotiating. She was revealing the internal limitations of the Zornak's entire approach to galactic interaction. Every psychological control mechanism was being systematically deconstructed, not through force, through understanding. The holographic displays continued to cascade with human research, techniques of collective healing, methods of transforming individual trauma into collective strength, approaches to communication that saw conflict as a chance for mutual understanding. Thar, the representative from the Proxima cluster, spoke for the first time. We are witnessing something unprecedented. Not a defeat, a transformation. The Zornak delegation sat in stunned silence. Humanity had done something extraordinary. They had turned the most sophisticated psychological warfare technique in the galaxy into a method of collective healing. Captain Krelax understood now what made humans so fundamentally dangerous. They didn't see other species as potential conquests or threats. They saw potential, raw material for collective growth, a new way of understanding existence itself. The diplomatic chamber continued to pulse with an energy that defied conventional understanding. 17 different civilizations, united by a single revolutionary concept. Psychological challenges were not something to be feared. They were opportunities for growth. The galaxy would never be the same, and humanity had shown them the way.